November 11th, 1940, 23:15 hours, 170 miles southeast of Taranto, Italy. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson checked his Fairey Swordfish's torpedo one final time, then climbed into the cockpit. Behind him, on HMS Illustrious's flight deck, 20 other Swordfish torpedo bombers waited in darkness, engines warming, crews making final preparations for an attack that would change naval warfare forever. The target was Taranto Harbor, Italy's main naval base, where 6 battleships, several cruisers, and dozens of destroyers sat protected by anti-aircraft batteries, barrage balloons, and torpedo nets. Italian Naval High Command considered the fleet invulnerable to air attack. Shore-based bombers lacked range to strike from British positions. Long-range bombing was too inaccurate against warships. The mathematics was simple. Taranto was safe. The Italians hadn't accounted for one variable: that the British had brought their airfield to within striking range, floating on a steel deck, displacing 23,000 tons that could steam at 30 knots and position aircraft where land-based bombers could never reach. Williamson received the launch signal at 2330 hours. His Swordfish accelerated down Illustrious's deck, gained speed, lifted into darkness over the Mediterranean. 20 bombers followed, obsolete biplanes with fabric-covered wings and a maximum speed of 138 meters, carrying torpedoes that weighed more than automobiles. They flew at wave-top height toward the Italian coast, navigation lights extinguished, maintaining radio silence, invisible to radar that couldn't detect fabric-skinned aircraft effectively. The formation arrived over Taranto at 2356 hours, climbed to 8,000 feet, and began attack runs that would sink or damage 3 Italian battleships in 1 hour. The Italian Naval Command would wake to a disaster they couldn't explain. How had British aircraft attacked from a direction where no airfields existed? The answer was revolutionary and terrifying. The airfields were mobile, sailing wherever the Royal Navy needed them, bringing air power to any ocean. Germany had thought they claimed the seas through U-boats and surface raiders. Britain had responded by turning ships into floating air bases that rendered obsolete every assumption about naval warfare. The age of battleships ruling oceans was ending. The age of carrier warfare, pioneered by Britain in desperation, was beginning. The Revolution. Britain's carrier development stemmed from strategic necessity rather than naval theory. By 1940, the Royal Navy faced existential threat. German and Italian air forces dominated skies over contested waters. Surface ships without air cover were vulnerable to bombing attacks they couldn't defend against. Traditional naval doctrine, that battleships with heavy armor and big guns ruled oceans, was proving obsolete when aircraft could sink battleships from ranges where the battleship's guns were useless. The solution required revolutionary thinking. Instead of building more battleships to fight obsolete naval warfare, build aircraft carriers that brought air power to sea. Transform naval vessels into mobile air bases that could position fighters and bombers anywhere oceans reached. The Royal Navy operated 7 fleet carriers by 1940, ships like Ark Royal, Illustrious, and Formidable that displaced between 23 and 27,000 tons and could carry between 36 and 48 aircraft each. They were armed with anti-aircraft guns, capable of 30 knots, and could range over 10,000 nautical miles without refueling. The Illustrious class introduced armored flight decks, 3 inches of hardened steel that could withstand bomb hits that would destroy the wooden decks of American and Japanese carriers. Germany, meanwhile, had built a navy focused on surface raiders and submarines, assuming land-based air power would provide coverage where needed. Their carrier fleet consisted of exactly 0 operational ships. Graf Zeppelin lay unfinished in Hamburg, a monument to German naval aviation that never materialized. The Kriegsmarine relied entirely on the Luftwaffe for air support, a dependency that worked well near shore but left German surface ships vulnerable once they ventured into open ocean beyond land-based fighter range. The disparity was strategic and ultimately decisive. Britain, forced to operate globally across oceans where land bases didn't exist, had developed carrier capability from necessity. Germany had assumed control of European coastline would be sufficient. By the time they realized carriers were essential to modern naval warfare, Britain had years of operational experience and a fleet that could project air power anywhere on Earth. Taranto. The raid on Taranto Harbor demonstrated carrier warfare's revolutionary potential in a single night of violence that changed everything. Italian naval strength in the Mediterranean was substantial. 6 battleships, including the modern Littorio and Vittorio Veneto, multiple heavy cruisers, destroyer flotillas, a fleet whose mere existence threatened British convoy routes to Egypt and Malta. Destroying or crippling it would shift the Mediterranean balance decisively in Britain's favor. Shore-based bombers from Malta or Egypt lacked both the range and accuracy for effective strikes against ships protected by harbor defenses. Traditional naval engagement risked British losses against a numerically superior Italian fleet operating close to its own bases. But carrier-based torpedo bombers launched from Illustrious could attack at night from a direction the Italians wouldn't anticipate, striking before the Italian fleet could react or maneuver. The operation was planned meticulously. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed Taranto repeatedly, noting ship positions, defensive arrangements, torpedo net placements. The attack was scheduled for November 11th, a night when moon phase provided enough light for visual attack but not enough for effective anti-aircraft defense. 21 Swordfish torpedo bombers would strike in 2 waves. The first wave of 12 aircraft launched at 20:30 hours, the second wave of 9 aircraft an hour later. 11 carried torpedoes modified to run in the shallow harbor water. The rest carried bombs and flares for illumination and distraction. 43 aircrew would fly 170 miles to target, attack the most heavily defended naval base in the Mediterranean, and attempt to return to a carrier they could barely see in darkness. The first wave arrived over Taranto at 2356 hours, precisely on schedule. Flare aircraft dropped illumination, lighting the harbor like artificial daylight. Torpedo bombers dove from 8,000 feet to wave-top height, accelerating toward anchored battleships. Italian anti-aircraft batteries opened fire immediately, tracers filling the sky, shells bursting. Barrage balloons deployed to impede low-level attack. The Swordfish pressed through defensive fire. Their slow speed, considered a fatal disadvantage in modern warfare, became an unexpected tactical advantage. Italian anti-aircraft guns designed to track modern bombers traveling at over 300 miles per hour couldn't adjust quickly enough to hit biplanes plodding at 90 knots. The fabric-covered aircraft were difficult for fire control radars to detect effectively. What should have been obsolete proved to be ideal for this specific mission. Torpedoes launched, dropped into harbor water, ran at preset depth toward battleships that couldn't maneuver in the confined anchorage. Explosions erupted along Conte di Cavour's hull. Flooding became uncontrollable, the ship settling onto the harbor bottom. Littorio took 3 torpedo hits, listing heavily, taking water through ruptured compartments. Caio Duilio took 1 hit, severely damaged, barely afloat. The second wave arrived 45 minutes later, attacking from a different angle to confuse defenders. More torpedoes launched, More explosions bloomed across the harbour. By 01:30 hours, the attack was complete. All aircraft withdrew except two lost to defensive fire, a remarkably low casualty rate given the intensity of Italian anti-aircraft fire. Dawn revealed the extent of the disaster. One Italian battleship had been sunk outright. Two more were severely damaged and would require months of repair. A fourth had sustained minor damage. Italian fleet combat strength had been reduced by approximately 50% in a single night. British losses amounted to 2 aircraft and 4 aircrew, a devastatingly asymmetric exchange that demonstrated the carrier's revolutionary power. The attack proved a fundamental truth about modern naval warfare. 21 obsolete biplanes launched from a carrier had accomplished what an entire battleship fleet couldn't achieve: the decisive crippling of an enemy navy without risking major British surface vessels. The era of carrier warfare had begun, proven in combat by Royal Navy desperation and innovation. The Arctic convoys. British carriers operating in Arctic waters demonstrated the doctrine's extreme limits, conducting flight operations in conditions that defied imagination and common sense. Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union were essential for Allied strategy, but devastatingly dangerous. German aircraft, submarines, and surface raiders hunted convoys through waters where weather alone could kill. Escort carriers provided air cover where no land-based fighters could reach, but the conditions tested crews and equipment beyond anything designers had anticipated. HMS Victorious and other carriers operated in the Arctic from 1942 onward, escorting convoys through seas where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, where spray froze on deck within seconds of hitting metal, where pilots launched into blizzards with visibility measured in yards rather than miles. The cold was omnipresent and lethal. Ice accumulated constantly on flight decks, aircraft, catapults, everything metal that the Arctic wind touched. Deck crews worked around the clock, chipping ice from surfaces where aircraft had to land, knowing that missing even a small patch could cause a fighter to skid off the deck into freezing water. Mechanics repaired engines with bare hands, despite temperatures that caused frostbite within minutes. Gloves prevented the fine manipulation of tools required for aircraft maintenance, so hands were exposed until numbness forced rotation to warming stations. Pilots launched into storms where navigation was impossible, relying on dead reckoning and hope to find carriers again through snow squalls and darkness. Some didn't return, not shot down by enemy action, but lost in weather that swallowed aircraft without trace. The casualty rate from weather exceeded casualties from combat, but flight operations continued because convoys depended on air cover that only carriers could provide. Lieutenant Charles Evans, a Seafire pilot aboard HMS Victorious during 1943 Arctic operations, later described what it meant to fly in those conditions. Taking off was terrifying. Ice covering the deck, wind howling across the flight surface, visibility perhaps 100 yards in driving snow. Landing was worse. You'd approach a carrier you could barely see through the weather, the deck heaving in heavy seas, ice everywhere creating a surface as treacherous as glass. Knowing that if you missed the arrestor wire, you'd probably go over the side and die of hypothermia before rescue could arrive. They lost more aircraft to weather than to German action, but they kept flying because merchantmen in the convoys below depended on fighters that could only operate from carrier decks. German naval commanders observed this with a mixture of respect and incomprehension. Why would the British fly in weather that grounded Luftwaffe aircraft operating from comfortable Norwegian bases? The answer was characteristically British, because the mission required it, and British doctrine didn't acknowledge that weather could stop operations any more than enemy action could. If convoys were sailing, carriers would fly, regardless of conditions that made flight operations suicidal by any rational assessment. Hunting Bismarck. The carrier's role in sinking Bismarck demonstrated how fundamentally naval warfare had changed in ways Germany hadn't understood or adapted to. When Bismarck broke into the Atlantic in May 1941, the traditional response would have been battleship-to-battleship engagement, massive warships exchanging fire until one sank or withdrew. Instead, the decisive blow came from carrier-based torpedo bombers that crippled Bismarck's steering, allowing surface ships to finish what aircraft had started. HMS Ark Royal, operating with Force H from Gibraltar, launched swordfish strikes against Bismarck on May 26 in deteriorating weather. The first strike achieved nothing. Torpedoes mistakenly targeted HMS Sheffield instead of Bismarck, fortunately without detonating due to faulty magnetic fuses. The second strike, launched at dusk in heavy seas, with pilots exhausted from hours of searching, achieved what battleships couldn't. A single torpedo struck Bismarck's stern, jamming her rudder hard to port. The tactical situation shifted instantly. Bismarck could no longer steer toward France and safety. She could only circle helplessly while British battleships closed for final engagement. The carrier aircraft hadn't sunk Bismarck directly, but they'd transformed a dangerous chase into an inevitable execution. Rear Admiral Lütjens, commanding Bismarck from his doomed ship, transmitted a final message that acknowledged the new reality he faced. Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. What he didn't say, but must have understood, was that Germany's most powerful battleship had been defeated not by equal opponent, but by obsolete biplanes that shouldn't have been able to threaten a modern warship. The lesson was unmistakable. Carriers could project power far beyond the visual range of surface ships, could attack with precision that battleship guns couldn't match at extreme range, could operate in weather that grounded land-based aircraft. The submarine threat Germany relied upon was real and dangerous, but carrier aviation introduced an asymmetric threat Germany couldn't counter effectively. Their surface fleet lacked carrier support, and the Luftwaffe couldn't provide coverage over open Atlantic waters where Britain's carrier-based aircraft operated with impunity. The Steel Cities. Fleet carriers were self-contained military bases that operated at sea for months without returning to port, entire cities dedicated to a single purpose. Below the flight deck lay massive hangar bays holding dozens of aircraft in various states of repair. Workshops were equipped to perform major overhauls. Engines could be completely rebuilt, wings replaced, damaged aircraft cannibalized for parts to keep others flying. Ammunition magazines stored hundreds of tons of ordnance in compartments designed to contain explosions if hit. Fuel tanks held millions of gallons of aviation gasoline. Volatile, dangerous, essential. Crew quarters housed over 1,500 men in cramped but organized spaces. Mess halls fed them in shifts. Medical facilities treated everything from routine illness to catastrophic combat injuries. Command centers coordinated air operations, tracked friendly and enemy positions, managed the complex choreography of launching and recovering dozens of aircraft daily. The carriers were floating cities organized around a single purpose: launching and recovering aircraft under combat conditions. Every system supported this mission. Every crew member had a role in the cycle that never stopped during combat operations. Maintenance crews repaired aircraft between missions, working through exhaustion to keep planes flying. Ordnance handlers loaded weapons, bombs, torpedoes, ammunition, with care that prevented accidents that could destroy the ship. Deck crews positioned aircraft for launch with precision timing that kept the flow moving. Pilots flew combat missions, returned, debriefed, slept briefly, flew again. Damage control teams managed battle damage, patching holes, controlling fires, keeping systems functional despite hits that would have sunk lesser ships. Cooks fed everyone. Medical officers treated wounded. The city never slept. During combat operations, carriers launched 40 to 80 sorties per day, aircraft taking off and landing in cycles that occurred every 2 to 3 hours. Each flight hour required 10 man-hours of maintenance to keep aircraft operational. The carriers consumed over 100,000 gallons of aviation gasoline weekly and expended tons of bombs and torpedoes daily. Crew members survived on 4 to 6 hours of sleep between watches, sustained by adrenaline, tea, and the understanding that failure meant death for themselves and the ships they protected. The pace was relentless, and the choreography was precise, despite the constant motion of the deck in heavy seas, despite enemy fire, despite exhaustion that made simple tasks feel impossible. Aircraft landed every minute during recovery operations, were struck below to the hangar, repaired, rearmed, and spotted back on deck for the next launch. The process continued regardless of weather, darkness, or battle damage because the mission demanded continuous air cover. Lieutenant Peter Davidson, deck landing officer aboard HMS Formidable, bore responsibility that aged men prematurely. Every landing was his responsibility, guiding pilots onto a pitching deck in darkness or bad weather, knowing that a mistimed signal meant death. He made perhaps 50 such life-or-death decisions daily during combat operations. The pressure was extraordinary, but showing it was impossible. Pilots needed absolute confidence that their deck landing officer knew what he was doing, that his signals were accurate, that following his guidance would bring them safely aboard rather than into the ocean. Malta and Mediterranean. British carriers in the Mediterranean sustained Malta and prevented Axis control of the Central Sea routes through operations that tested crews and ships to their absolute limits. Malta, a small island strategically positioned between Italy and North Africa, was essential to Allied Mediterranean strategy. From Malta, RAF and Royal Navy forces could attack Axis supply convoys to North Africa, strangling Rommel's Africa Corps. But Malta was under siege, bombed constantly by Italian and German aircraft, requiring constant resupply of food, ammunition, fuel, and replacement aircraft. Carriers provided 3 critical capabilities that made Malta's survival possible. They escorted convoys carrying supplies through the Mediterranean gauntlet. They ferried replacement aircraft to the island, launching fighters and bombers that would fly the remaining distance to Malta's airfields. They attacked Italian naval forces that threatened those convoys, preventing surface raiders from massacring merchantmen. The convoy operations were desperate affairs that combined naval warfare's worst elements. Carriers would escort merchantmen through the entire Mediterranean, facing Italian torpedo bombers attacking in coordinated waves, German dive bombers striking with precision, Italian fleet sorties attempting to intercept convoys, and submarine attacks throughout the journey. Fighter aircraft from carriers would intercept bombers at extreme range. Torpedo bombers would attack surface raiders before they could engage merchantmen. And all of this occurred while the carriers themselves came under sustained attack. Operation Pedestal in August 1942 exemplified the desperation and cost of these operations. 14 merchantmen departed Gibraltar, escorted by 2 battleships, 3 fleet carriers, 7 cruisers, and 24 destroyers. Massive force committed to a single convoy because Malta was weeks away from surrender due to starvation. The Axis threw everything available at the convoy, over 500 aircraft sorties, submarine attacks that sank the carrier HMS Eagle, and surface raiders attempting to intercept. 9 merchantmen were sunk. HMS Eagle went down to submarine attack. The cruiser HMS Manchester was lost. A destroyer was sunk. But 5 merchantmen reached Malta, carrying enough supplies to sustain the island through the crisis. The carriers flew over 800 sorties during the 5-day operation, maintaining air cover despite constant combat and damage. HMS Indomitable absorbed multiple bomb hits that penetrated her armored flight deck, causing catastrophic damage below decks. With traditional wooden flight decks, she would have been knocked completely out of action. Instead, damage control teams fought fires, patched holes, and cleared wreckage while flight operations continued from the damaged deck. She kept launching and recovering aircraft despite damage that would have sent American carriers back to Pearl Harbor for months of repair. The cost was severe, but the strategic result was decisive. Malta survived. Axis North African forces never received adequate supplies. The Mediterranean remained contested rather than becoming an Axis-controlled lake, and British carriers had proven they could sustain operations under the most intense combat conditions imaginable. The Pacific Turn. By 1944, British carriers were operating in the Pacific, joining American forces against Japan and bringing a different carrier doctrine that would prove its value against an unexpected threat. The British Pacific Fleet brought carriers designed around fundamentally different philosophy from American ships. American carriers prioritized maximum aircraft capacity with wooden flight decks that allowed more hangar space and larger air groups. British carriers had fewer aircraft but armored decks that proved unexpectedly valuable against kamikaze attacks that dominated the final year of Pacific fighting. When a kamikaze aircraft struck an American carrier, the impact and explosion typically penetrated the wooden flight deck, causing fires and destruction in the hangar below that knocked the ship out of action for weeks or months of repair at Pearl Harbor. When a kamikaze struck a British carrier's armored deck, the impact certainly caused damage, fires, casualties, twisted steel, but the 3-inch armor prevented penetration to the hangar below. Damage control teams would clear wreckage from the flight deck, extinguish fires, patch holes with steel plates, and resume flight operations within hours. HMS Formidable, Victorious, Indomitable, and Indefatigable operated as Task Force 37 attached to the U.S. Fifth Fleet during the Okinawa campaign. They absorbed kamikaze hits that would have disabled American carriers, cleared wreckage with characteristic British matter-of-factness, and continued operations while American ships withdrew for extended repairs. American naval officers observed this with professional respect, tempered by slight envy. Vice Admiral John McCain, witnessing British carriers resume operations after kamikaze hits, reportedly commented that when a kamikaze hit an American carrier, it meant 6 months of repair at Pearl Harbor. When one hit a British carrier, they just sent a crew with shovels to clear the deck and kept flying. The British carrier's contribution to Pacific War was smaller in absolute terms than American. Fewer ships, fewer aircraft, less striking power. But their presence mattered symbolically and operationally. Britain was demonstrating that even after 6 years of global war, after fighting from the Arctic to the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, the Royal Navy remained capable of projecting power anywhere on Earth. The fleet that had pioneered carrier warfare at Taranto was finishing the war, helping crush Japan in waters halfway around the world from where they'd started. The Grey Dawn, Mediterranean Sea, November 12, 1940, 04:30 hours. HMS Illustrious, returning from Taranto. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson sat in the debriefing room describing his attack run to intelligence officers who could barely believe the reports emerging from Italian radio intercepts. 3 battleships sunk or crippled. Half the Italian fleet's combat power eliminated in one night. British losses: 2 aircraft, 4 crew. The numbers seemed impossible, but photographic reconnaissance confirmed them. The harbour was filled with burning or listing battleships. Oil slicks covered acres of water. The pride of the Italian Navy had been destroyed by aircraft launched from a ship that could steam away before dawn and be 100 miles distant when the Italians realized what had happened. Williamson was exhausted, but his mind raced with the implications of what they'd accomplished. Naval warfare had changed fundamentally in the past 6 hours. Battleships, those massive, expensive monuments to naval power, were now vulnerable to aircraft they couldn't see, couldn't shoot, couldn't escape. Carriers could strike from beyond visual range, attack at night, and withdraw before retaliation was possible. The Italians had learned this lesson at devastating cost. The Germans would learn it when Bismarck was crippled by carrier aircraft and destroyed by battleships. The Japanese would learn it at Midway when American carriers destroyed their fleet. Every navy would eventually understand what the British had proven at Taranto. That control of the seas now belonged to whoever could project air power across them. On Illustrious's flight deck, maintenance crews were already preparing aircraft for the next mission. The carrier was steaming at 30 knots towards safe waters, but flight operations would continue. That was the carrier's fundamental advantage. It was mobile airbase that never stopped operating, that brought air power to wherever the fleet needed it, that could strike and disappear before enemies could respond effectively. Germany had thought they claimed the seas through submarines and surface raiders. They'd built a navy designed to strangle Britain's supply lines and challenge British surface ships for control of crucial sea lanes. But they'd missed the revolution happening on carrier decks, where obsolete biplanes were proving more dangerous than battleship guns, where mobility was more valuable than armor, where the ability to strike first from unexpected angles mattered more than raw firepower. The grey dawn broke over the Mediterranean, revealing empty horizon. Somewhere behind them, Taranto burned. Ahead lay more operations, more convoys to protect, more battles to fight with carriers that redefined what naval power meant. The British fleet had brought floating airfields to war, and the seas would never be the same.